Okay, thanks. Yes, sir.
Hi. My question is mainly for Matt. I guess I'm kind of unsatisfied with the way you went about answering the question that maybe a lot of people wanted to know was, the meat of the discussion really is, how do we know we are right in our morals? Because to know if we have the right, scientific theory, we go out in the world and we do science. So with respect to our moral intuitions, can you maybe more clearly state how would you go about either confirming or refuting if you have the right ideas about what morality, what is moral and what is not, without talking about God?
I think that's a good question. I mean, to frame morality as needing to meet the standards of science is to put science as the ultimate justification mechanism and then ask how morality can meet that. What I would suggest is that it's really science that has to answer to morality rather than the other way around. That would be one point that I would want to make, which is, why do we need science? I think I think that we don't need science, but a question that we need to answer is, what's the point of science, which we do answer. But then the question still remains, how do we go about verifying our ethical conclusions? And if it's true, as I've suggested, that the content of objective moral conclusions resides in other people's interests, then the way that we go about confirming that we've come to the right conclusion is by talking with people, by having a discussion, by having a dialogue, by asking people what sort of things they value, what they interest, and genuinely caring about what other people are trying to do and what other people value. So that, I think, would be the constituent of confirmation in ethical framework.
Dr. Rana? Okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've got a question that's for both of you. It's related to intention and that kind of stuff. So, you're saying that to found our moral ethics, we need to have a relational based ethic or something of the sort, where we care about each other in terms of people in our society. But isn't that the very basis of colonization, that we believe we're bringing the best for other people? And Dr. Rana, you say that we need to have an objective basis for morality, but we've had Christian traditions that have totally jettisoned this whole idea, and like the Crusades, for example. But in the Christian tradition, there seems to be these examples, with Gandhi and Tutu, who've been able to question the structures of a society, the order of a society. So my question for both of you is there something within the specific states within Christianity that isn't simply to support moral order, but rather to question that order itself? Like those good examples that have gone out and really questioned the heart of what's made that society sick.
For example, you bring up the Crusades. That, I don't believe, was an action that was birthed out of the Christian worldview, but rather it was, again, going back to the fact that you have human beings that are using a religious system as a means to gain power. And so that's clearly an example where the behavior of Christians runs contrary to, again, what the moral expectations is for Christians based on what Scripture teaches. And you're able to, I think, identify that, again, because we all know what Christianity expects of people. And again, when Christians deviate from that expectation, it's very easy to recognize that and to hold Christians to the standard that, again, they espouse, or at least the faith espouses. In terms of does Christianity have a framework or the mechanism to question aspects of the society that are sick, I think the answer is yes. And, in the community that I live in, churches are perhaps the most active organizations that work towards trying to achieve social justice. There are a number of Christians who work as advocates for social justice. So, and their motivation is birthed out of, again, their faith. And the idea, going back to the image of God, that human beings are made in God's image and have an intrinsic value and worth. And so it's important to fight against institutions that devalue human life. And to do that in ways that challenge the system, but yet I think respect the law and work to change the law. So
I agree with you that churches can extend or are actively participating in advocating social justice change. It's real, and they're doing that very extensively and successfully. What I think would be an interesting question is, what sort of original imperatives can religion give us that a secular way of thinking can't? So, what can religion tell us to do or not do that we couldn't? And this is like, the famous challenge of Christopher Hitchens, right? What could a religion tell us to do or not do that secular reasoning couldn't arrive at? And it seems to me the sorts of things that religion uniquely tells us to do or not do are all somehow superstitious, unfortunately. Like, they're based on things like, the prohibition to abortion is based on the assumption of conception being the origin of human life. It's a metaphysical assumption. It's not even something that we can verify. Like the opposition to... those sorts of imperatives that religion spearheads seem to be the ones that we don't actually agree on being good.
yes, sir.
This question is for Marianne. I presume that last night's debate perhaps dealt with the leap from non-life to life, but I think the other leap is equally large, and if not by the image of God, then how would you explain the leap from impersonal to personal to rational to metacognition to the ability or desire to spend Saturday evening discussing these things, to the spiritual longings or caring, as you said, caring for other people as a foundation for morality?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is the question that has animated moral philosophers for centuries, which is, I take it that your question is really, how does one move or convince someone who lacks all of these things that I'm saying are necessary for moral conclusions? How does one convince such a person into the arena of morality to begin with? And I think the answer is, unfortunately, there really isn't any way to get someone who utterly lacks, so for example, empathy or compassion for other human beings, or a desire to reconcile their interests with other people's interests. Such a person is what we characterize as a sociopath. And, unfortunately, a sociopath is to moral truths what a deaf, dumb, and blind person is to scientific truths. It's just sort of like, how do you convince a deaf, dumb, and blind person that there's such a spectrum in a rainbow, or that sounds are in a certain structure, reverberate on the ear. You sort of have to be embedded, you sort of have to be within the framework of morality, or you have to already care in order to be able to reason about morality. And the attempt to forego that fact has led to, I think, a lot of strange conclusions, like we see in Plato's Republic. His answer to the question, why should we be good, is, hey, look at this city that I can make over here. It's like, how did you answer the question of why we should be good? And these are the sorts of things that philosophers have done for centuries, is just sort of do a dance when faced with this question. I would recommend Bertrand Williams' book, Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, for dealing with this question. It's just basically an unfortunate truth, I think, that we can't convince sociopaths to be moral? I think if I've understood your question properly. I mean, we can talk after as well.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my question's for Dr. Rana. So tonight you agreed with Ron's preface that, or process rather, that we can unveil morality through this kind of ethical process of confirming judgments and our values, kind of back and forth. But that the Bible would be kind of a shortcut to true morality, and instead of going through this process, we can open up and check. Yes, that's moral. My question is, I guess if there seems to be, some contradictions that I find troubling. One being that in today's day and age, I think that we all universally agree that slavery is wrong. Yet in the Bible, it sort of seems to say that it's okay so long as we treat our slaves okay. I was curious if you could respond to that.
Yeah, and I think the slavery that we see in recent human history is qualitatively different than the type of slavery that we saw, at least operating within the nation of Israel, as an example. Because there, slaves were basically every seventh year given the opportunity to have their freedom. So it was 6 years of service where they were to be treated in a particular way. In the seventh year, they were granted their freedom. So you can almost view it as, again, not slavery in the sense that we typically think of it, where you have a person in a state of bondage and there's no hope or anything of them ever gaining freedom. And so it was a very different type of system that really involved, in a sense, a commitment that was then renewed on the seventh year if that slave desired to stay with that particular household or what have you. And I'm not sure that Christianity ever, that when the Christian faith was birthed, the system of slavery was basically in the Roman world. It wasn't a Christian system. It was a Roman system in which the faith was operating in. But even within that system, the exhortation was for masters to treat their slaves with respect and to treat them in a proper manner. So, in a sense, Christianity was not in a position to do anything about the slavery of the world at that time.
So I have a question for you, Dr. Rana. In that context, are you okay with that sort of slavery? If I would release my slave every 7 years, is that okay?
Well,
I mean, I appreciate the historical point that you made. I think that's a valid point. But I don't see that makes it okay.
well, I used to work for a Fortune 500 company. That was a form of slavery. In a sense,
So is this your 7th year? Is that what you're saying? You're on.
in a sense, unless you are independently wealthy, you have to work for somebody. And when you work for somebody, you have to do what they expect you to do to remain in employment. So, it's part of it's just the nature of economics, I think, that people willingly serve and subject themselves to the will of other people for the opportunity of livelihood.
Well, fair enough, but the people who were enslaved in ancient Israel and Rome weren't voluntarily engaging in an economic relationship that was consensual and they were getting paid for their work. A lot of them might have even come from independently wealthy families who just happened to lose the war, and they were